Hi, Bloody Recaps here. Today I'm going to explain thriller movie The Fugitive. Keep your eyes open and stay focused. One unfortunate evening, police discovered the body of the famous surgeon's wife, who had called 911 for help. Journalists consider it an act of domestic violence, but at the station, Dr. Richard Kimball, the woman's husband, recounts the events of that evening, and we are shown that at the banquet, there was no fighting in the family. On his way home, he was called in for emergency surgery and his wife promised to wait for him, but when he returned home there was a disfigured wife and a tall man with a prosthetic arm in place of his right arm. But the police could not believe that version because many facts showed that Richard had done it. During the trial, the audience is shown a 911 call from Helen where Helen calls for Richard's help. But the police believed that she blamed her husband even though Richard was only going upstairs at the time. Sentence: sent to Illinois State Prison, where he is executed by administering a lethal dose of poison. On the prison bus, Richard notices strange glances between the prisoners and one of them has a fit, but when a guard approaches him, he stabs him in the belly with a prearranged brush and gets shot by the other, and an accomplice in the fight forces the guard to kill the driver and the bus goes off into a ditch. One of the cops throws Richard a key to help his colleague. He gets free, but the key that fell to the ground is picked up by his cellmate Kaplan. The guard tries to help, but when a train is heard approaching, he escapes as does the prisoner. So Richard pulls him out alone, but that's not all, as the rear cars have uncoupled and come off the tracks. But Richard gets lucky again and manages to take cover under the bridge. Kaplan helps him upstairs and, having freed the doctor from his shackles, escapes away. Agent Tommy arrives on the scene and overhears an interview with an officer who makes himself out to be a hero because he saved his colleague. According to his testimony, all the prisoners are dead, but the detective has found the shackles, which means there are escaped prisoners. Tommy instructs him to set up checkpoints around 15 miles away and prepare to search, and Richard sneaks through the woods at night and by morning comes out to the first civilization and steals the mechanic's clothes. Richard makes his way through town, and the dispatcher has already been informed of the blood trail in town. Richard makes his way to the hospital through the back door and is about to treat his wound, but an officer arrives at the hospital at the same time. Richard nimbly hides in the bathroom from the nurse, and when she leaves, he cuts off his beard. When he gets out into the hallway, he has to run into an officer who thankfully doesn't recognize him, and outside he introduces himself as a surgeon to help with the wounded, but as soon as they get inside, he rushes off in his car. But they tracked him down and went looking for him in a helicopter, and successfully find him. When Richard drives into the tunnel, he thinks he's escaped pursuit, but no such luck. He's surrounded on both sides, so he jumps into the gutters and takes off running. Tommy went after him, but slipped and lost his gun, which Richard picked up. He confesses that he's innocent and goes on the run, but Tommy has a second gun and manages to catch Richard at the drain pipe in the reservoir, so Richard decides to take his chances and jump down. The police realize he is dead, but Tommy sends search parties to work. Richard still manages to survive and make it ashore while the police scour the waters where he jumped. In the woods he collapsed without strength because of his wound and fell asleep into the night while he dreamed visions of his beloved, then abruptly changed to trying to save her and fighting with the one-armed man. He doesn't wake up until the next morning covered by a blanket of leaves. Agent Tommy returns to his state, because he was promised that the search will be carried out round the clock, and Richard manages to get out of the woods at the first motel he sees, to repaint his hair and start hitchhiking. And Tommy reports that they tracked down Kaplan, and the next morning they prepared an operation and broke into his house, and he took the policeman hostage, and Tommy shot the criminal. Richard got through to his lawyer, but he refused to help him. And the police had already listened to their call and found out that Richard was 6 blocks away. Richard stops his colleague Charlie on the road, who gives him some money. And while Tommy is convinced that Richard killed his wife for money, he finds a temporary place to live and sneaks into the hospital, the prosthetics department, and steals one of the doctor's passes. Charlie turns out to be a very good friend, for he tells the police that he saw him today, but he gave no information about him. The police conduct their investigation and Richard is, and also when he falls asleep at night, he dreams of the look and feel of the prosthetic bandit, but he wakes up to the noise of the police outside the window. But they have not come for him, but for the landlady's children, who it turns out were selling drugs to children. In the evening of the same day, smiling sweetly at the employee, he sneaks into the office of the clinic and sets up a search by details with similar injuries in the city. There turned out to be 5 such people. The kid who was selling drugs tells policemen that they have Richard living in their basement, while he wanders from his fellow stooge who can't make the easiest diagnosis. Suddenly a nurse asks him for help to drive a boy with broken ribs to his room, and Tommy is already examining his living quarters and finds attempts to forge a hospital ID. In the elevator, Richard does his own examination and diagnosis, so he immediately sends him to the operating room. The nurse stopped him in the corridor and asked him to wait, knowingly taking his pass, but he left the hospital. So she testified to Tommy and told him how he saved the boy. Richard had already started to check his list, but suddenly Tommy, who had been captured by the police on Richard's tip, appeared. He rushed through the door, but his foot got stuck, so several bullets flew into the glass in front of him. And then, just in time for the parade, Richard took a disguise and fled. The press came to Tommy, and Richard had already snuck into the house of his next suspect, namely Federico Sykes, who has a spare prosthetic in his shelf, as well as a joint photo from his youth with his wife and work colleague. He also found invitations to a banquet, so that night wasn't exactly an ordinary night, but rather a setup. Richard calls the station and is not going to stop his investigation, so he does not hang up so the police can trace his location. But the landlord returns when his place is swarming with police. Tommy interrogates him, but gets no useful information, but suspects him anyway, so he asks to be followed. Richard contacts Charles and tells him that he has found the killer, but Charles says he died last summer. Sykes has already spotted him being followed and is on the phone with John Doe. Richard, meanwhile, goes to see an old acquaintance of his for information about the man who died last summer. The police also inquire about him, and Sykes tricks the police into calling the fire department and leaving the house. Richard visits an old friend and she lets him know that someone else is involved in this case, because the day Lance died, Richard suspects half of all the tissue samples Richard sent to the lab to invent a new drug were signed for, which means Lance cheated everyone and patented the research only on himself. Sykes reports that he couldn't find Richard, but he's already moving out of the alley, so he won't miss him this time. The police discover Sykes is missing. Richard sits quietly in the subway, but a civilian recognizes him and reports him to the police, but immediately Sykes shows up and they have a fight and a policeman breaks in who Sykes shoots, and Richard does emergency braking and comes out of the fight victorious and then escapes from the train. The radio tells Tommy that Richard killed the cop. Meanwhile, he arrives to see Dr. Charles and interrupts his speech about the drug while the police are already blocking all entrances and exits. Charles escapes from the hall and Richard goes after him. They have a fight, during which the officers give the command to shoot when Richard is alone, but the shots fly past, and Tommy asks that they call him off at once. The men fall down and make their way to the laundry room, where Tommy has already arrived and tries to convince Richard to turn himself in. Tommy knows he is innocent because Charles had access to his car and house that night, so there was no break-in. Meanwhile, Charles knocks out the officer and takes his gun. He's about to kill Tommy, but Richard saves him. They escorted him in as a detainee, but in the car Tommy uncuffed him and they went from there as colleagues. Don't forget to support the channel by subscribing and liking, and turn on notifications, because with them you'll be the first to know about new videos. Thank you very much for watching. See you again soon.